I'm Jeff Rutherford. I'm a quilter, a podcaster, and a writer. And I live in Western Massachusetts, in the Northampton, Massachusetts area. And I have two great teenage sons, 13 and 17. Sure. I wasn't really exposed to quilting in terms of making quilts when I was a child. We definitely had quilts, and some of those quilts had been made by my father's mother, so my paternal grandmother. But by the time that I knew her later in her life, she wasn't making quilts. She had really made quilts, as some people would say, as utility quilts, because they didn't have a lot of money growing up. So she made quilts for her kids to sleep under and herself to sleep under on cold nights. So I didn't really, so as I said, when I knew her as my grandmother, she had stopped making quilts. But in terms of my childhood, I did have a neighbor who showed me cross stitch, and I made a couple of projects. And then the other two things that I did was, this was I was like probably preteen in the late 70s. And in America, latch hook rug projects were a big thing. So I made a latch hook rug, and that's where you're using a little tool to thread kind of this yarn onto a foundation. So I did that. And then later, probably when I was in 8th or 9th grade, I ended up taking a class to make soft sculpture dolls, similar to the Cabbage Patch dolls, which were popular at the time. And I made one of those. But that's pretty much the extent of my early crafting, if you could call it that. Sure. I was living in New York City. I lived there for 8.5 years. And at one point when I was living in the city, and this was probably around 2000 or maybe early 2001, I visited a park in New York City in the Bronx called Wave Hill. And they had a very, very small art gallery, just one room. And I just kind of stumbled in that by accident. And they were having a exhibition of art quilts from New Yorkers. And I was just kind of blown away by the artistry and the craft. And kind of on the spot, I just said, I would like to try to learn how to make a quilt. At the time, there was one quilt store in Manhattan called the City Quilter. I went there. Their schedule of classes didn't really work out with my working schedule. But what I did end up doing was I subscribed to a couple of quilting magazines that were monthly magazines. So I had the desire, I had the interest. The magazines were coming each month and kind of making me even more curious. And then in 2002, I moved from New York City to Western Massachusetts. And within a couple of months of moving in 2002, I took my first quilting class. And it was immediate for me. I immediately enjoyed the whole process, the sewing machine, fabrics, patterns, and as you know, we can talk about later, also the community as I started meeting more and more quilters. But really the excitement for me is in making the quilt and the actual manual process of sewing, cutting the fabric, etc. And so I took that first quilting class, and even before the class had ended, I went home and on my own time looked up a pattern and had already made a second quilt by the time I finished my first one. So it was just something that would just really grab me, and that was in 2002. It's now 2021, and I've been doing it ever since.
So
I was. So I did, when I was in my 20s and part of my 30s, I was really doing a lot of fiction writing. I had a couple of short stories published. I was published in kind of a paperback anthology of science fiction and fantasy stories. But I have to say that the more I started quilting, the less I have been focused on fiction writing most recently. But what I did do was I've always been interested in books and reading. In addition to the quilting as we're talking about, I've always been a voracious reader. When I lived in New York City in the mid-90s, I worked for a literary agency in New York City, so I actually worked in book publishing. So around 2009, I noticed podcasts because I ended up doing public relations for software and technology companies. So I was very aware of the early days of podcasts. And I heard one other book podcast. Well, I heard a couple of other book podcasts that really kind of captured my attention. So in 2009, I started a podcast where I interview writers and authors about their books. And I've interviewed over 350 writers at this point. The podcast is still going. It's called the Reading and Writing Podcast. I've interviewed many New York Times bestsellers. I tend to interview writers that, for the lack of a better word, people consider commercial fiction, meaning thrillers, mysteries, science fiction, fantasy, some memoirs and some nonfiction. So I've been doing that. And, I'm not saying this to bang my own drum. Like, I know all of the book publicists at the major publishers now, and they really contact me to try to get me to interview their writers. But that's something that I've always done just as a labor of love and as a hobby. That's not my day job. I still work in marketing for a software company. And most recently, in terms of podcasting, I actually, during the pandemic, decided to start a second podcast specifically about quilting, and it's called the Quilting Stories Podcast. And I got interested in doing that. I have listened to a few quilting podcasts, and some are really, really well done. I thought a lot of them tended to veer towards interviewing, for the lack of a better word, kind of quilting celebrities, people who are out with a new quilting book, and that's fine. And I know a lot of those teachers and quilt professionals, and I really respect them. But when I looked at the quilting podcast out there, I felt like what might be a good thing to do is just interview some quilters that people have never heard about and just talk to them about their passion for quilting. So I started that in the pandemic. I haven't been doing it as frequently as I hope to, but I'm working out some of my scheduling issues and just time, and I plan to do a lot more of those interviews. So that's kind of, that's what I do in addition to quilting. And I also do CrossFit. It really differs depending on the quilt. I do a fair amount of quilts that are from established patterns where a pattern designer creates a pattern. A lot of them are definitely influenced by traditional patterns. I haven't done as much what I would consider really abstract or improv. I want to do more of that. But so I'm usually focused on somewhat of a pattern, though I'll explain there are other quilts that I do as well. But so with those, I usually look at the pattern, and I find myself oftentimes veering off from the colors that other people might be doing. For example, one thing that I've been doing for the last, I think 3 or 4 years, I think maybe 4 years, there's a very popular quilter in the United States. Her name is Bonnie Hunter. And one thing that she does is every year on the day after Thanksgiving in the United States, she releases the first clue of a mystery quilt. And what I mean by that, and if someone isn't familiar with the quilting world, I'll explain what a mystery quilt is. Usually if I'm doing an established pattern, I know exactly what the quilt's going to look like when I finish. With a mystery quilt, you actually don't. Like if you decide to make the quilt, you don't know what the finished product is going to look like. What she does is once a week she releases a clue, meaning she releases one piece of the instructions, like make 100 half square triangles or make 150 of this block. And so you're doing that week by week until usually the 7th or 8th week, when she does kind of the big reveal and shows you how all of these pieces are going to be put together into a finished quilt. So the reason I mention that is I've been doing that for the last 4 years each year. And she releases a suggested color palette that she used for the quilt. And a lot of people follow her color palette, and I think there's some really stunning quilts from that. But I oftentimes will kind of make the quilt unique and my own by veering off of her recommended color palette. For example, I'm finishing up one now, which I'll show you in a minute. Her color palette had some grays and oranges. And I ended up going in a completely different direction and using Christmas fabrics and some bright blue teal fabrics, kind of like an ice blue. So that's if I'm doing a pattern and I've like really explored different colors. I also do what I would consider, I'm not sure if I would call them art quilts or abstract quilts, and I'm starting to do more in this area. But one thing, like one quilt that I'm working on right now that hasn't been finished, I pieced letters for words, and I pieced letters for words that are song lyrics from a song by the band The Cure. And so what I'm going to do is combine those lyrics and those letters that I pieced together using fabric with some images that relate to what I think the lyrics say to me. So I actually have plans to do more of that, of making more word quilts with some abstract designs mixed in. So that's kind of how I embark on a quilt, if that makes any sense. Well, I don't dye any fabric. I definitely use commercially purchased fabric. I have been doing a lot more solid quilts, meaning solid colors, as opposed to a print or a design. And I kind of go back and forth between using prints, which are kind of the surface design on the fabric, or using just solid fabrics, which if people, even with a glancing knowledge of quilting, if they look at quilts, traditionally, a lot of the Amish quilts were made with solid fabrics, meaning one solid color, no surface design or pattern. So I, again, commercially purchased fabric and commercially made. I don't dye my own fabric. I do use a electric sewing machine, which I recently upgraded. I wouldn't say upgraded. I switched from a Janome to a Juki, and the thing with the Juki is it's all metal, so there are no computer parts, which I like. It's very fast, and it's also just one stitch, so all you have is one straight stitch, as opposed to many sewing machines that you buy have a lot of decorative stitches. Mine is just a straight stitch, and yeah, that's kind of what I use. I tend to make a lot of very large quilts. So I have made a few baby quilts here and there for friends and family, but I usually tend to do something very big that you could put on a bed if you wanted to. Not everything I make is for a bed. One of the ones that I'm going to show you, I hang on the wall, but a lot of them. Both of my sons have a quilt that I made on their beds. They will occasionally. I mean, I'm doing it right in the middle of where I live. The entryway to my apartment is where I have my sewing machine set up. So they certainly go by and will comment on colors, but they haven't caught the quilting bug, and that's fine. They'll figure out what they're interested in. Like I said, I have been doing a lot of solid colors. I tend to use green a lot, I've noticed, but I tend to try to do a variety of colors. But I would say probably bright and bold. I'm definitely not someone who gravitates towards kind of muted colors. That's not me at all. I tend to let myself go. Some of the word quilts, I'm probably thinking about the music. As I mentioned, I use song lyrics. So that I might be thinking about the music, but I really, it might sound odd, but to me, it's a very meditative, relaxing process. Just the actual listening to the machine, the sound of the needle, the movement of the fabric through the sewing machine. It's just a very relaxing endeavor doing that. But at the same time, usually when I'm quilting, I do have loud music going as well. It is. It's like a jigsaw puzzle or a matrix. You have to be very focused. Usually what I'll do is I'm most focused when I'm cutting fabric, because that's where you are kind of cutting the individual pieces that will then be fitted together. So when I'm cutting, I usually will either turn the music way down just so that I can focus. But once I'm sewing, I usually have the pieces fitted together, so there's not a ton of like figuring it out as I'm sitting at the machine. I don't work in a series, but I'm always working. So I've been, one of the things that we can talk about in a moment, if you're interested, I go to two quilt retreats every year. But one of the things that I was going to mention is oftentimes on these retreats, which can be 4 or 5 days long, I will finish a quilt top and I might take a break and take a nap, or sit and read for a little while. But usually within the hour, I'm working on my next thing. I have projects that are half completed that once I finish this one, which I'll show you in a moment, I'll immediately turn and start working on something else. It's just part of, I guess, just part of my process at this point, that I'm always got something going in the machine. So usually they started out being like 3 days long, and they keep getting longer and longer to about 5 or 6 days. In the specific retreat, so I go to 2 every year, but this one of the ones that I was going to mention, it's actually all men. So it's all male quilters. And I've been to over 20 of those. We have them twice a year. Unfortunately, we weren't able to have the last 3 due to the pandemic, but we are slated to have another one in September. And we do them up in Vermont, and we kind of take over an inn, or hotel, small hotel, and inn. And there's usually anywhere from 18 to 20 guys there for 4 to 5 days, and we eat there at the hotel. The hotel provides our meals, so it's literally just solid 4 or 5 days of nonstop sewing, and lots of camaraderie as well. And then the other retreat that I've been on several times is with a local guild called the Northampton Modern Quilt Guild that I'm a member of. Absolutely. I don't do that many collaborations, but I definitely have a number of quilting friends, and, for the lack of a better word, confidants, that I will take photos of fabrics, or if I have a question about a specific ruler or a way a block gets put together, I'll just snap some photos and send them a text message. And some of them we talk, once a week via text about what we're working on and any tips or tricks. I don't know if I necessarily have a guiding philosophy. I think it's just something that I got into, was attracted to, and immediately just kind of fell into it. And it wasn't something that I planned in my life. Like I said, I was working on a lot of fiction at that point in my life and writing fiction, and I thought that I might be a novelist at some point. That hasn't happened yet. It's not to say it won't happen. But the quilting, it came up unexpectedly for me, and it's just something that I really intensely enjoy. And So I don't have a real guiding philosophy. It's just something that I really enjoy doing as an intrinsic part of, at this point, my life. And like I said, I really do find it kind of meditative and relaxing.
It's in-
I agree. I agree. And as I mentioned, I have plans to do more of these word quilts. So even there, I mean, if I wanted to, I could try to write a short story using, piece letters if that's what I wanted to do. I think probably my interest more is doing song lyrics and maybe some phrases and words that have meaning to me personally. It really depends. I mean, like I said, I'm working on one now that is from the band The Cure, and it was actually the first Cure song that I had ever heard in the 80s, and the song is called Caterpillar. It's not one of their big hits, but people who really like the band know it, and it was just always like a really favorite song of mine, and so I decided to make a quilt using those lyrics. So the specific lyrics that I ended up using is "You flicker and you're beautiful, you glow inside my head," and I can send you after this interview an image of that quilt that I'm working on if you want to include it in the final video. But it's really, like I said, I don't really know why I chose those letters. It just resonated with me over the years every time I heard that song. I think you're right. I think I have a lot of different qualities, both extrovert and introvert. I've definitely discovered over the last year of the pandemic that I have extroverted tendencies that have been I've struggled with over the last year. But yeah, I think it's an interesting mixture. Oh, without a doubt. I'm working on one quilt. And I've been working on it for several years. I work on it and then put it away. It's called a 365 quilt, and that means it has 365 individual blocks, so one for each day of the year. And it was created by a quilter in Australia, Catherine Kerr. And if someone is interested, they can just Google 365 quilt. It ends up being a really enormous quilt, but she really used vintage quilt blocks that have been in kind of the quilting world since the 1900s. And she did a lot of research, and each one of her patterns that she would send out each day. And this is a free thing that you can just go and subscribe to her email, and she sends you one pattern per day for a total of 365. And the one thing that I liked is that with each one of the patterns that she sent out, she actually had historical information about when the block originated. So she had done a lot of research in addition to designing the quilt. And so what I was going to say in terms of the challenges, a lot of these blocks are on a very small size, like very tiny. So there could be 15, 20, 25 pieces of fabric in like a 2.5-inch square, or I think like maybe a 3-inch square. So that is a lot of very small piecing work, and so that was very challenging. But to your overall question about challenges, again, if you're doing a quilt that has a specific pattern, a rigid pattern, it does involve a lot of attention to detail, because if you are trying to follow a pattern and you want every block to fit together, then you have to have precise measurements. so that when you attach one block to the next one, that they're approximately the same size. Because if you don't and you get out of whack, it can really impact the structure of the quilt, just in terms of the way it fits together. So what you're doing is, in terms of the challenges, is if you sew a block and you lay it down to the next block, and you can see that you suddenly have a block that's a half an inch to an inch bigger than the one next to it, then you have to kind of go backwards and figure out, like, why did I sew this together in such a way that I'm having an excess of an inch of fabric? And so you have to go and look at each piece and, oh, maybe I accidentally cut this a half inch bigger than it should be. So you literally have a tool called a seam ripper, and you're just ripping out the thread and re-sewing the entire block to get it to that precision. So that's one of the challenges in terms of doing something with a strict pattern. To me, the challenge that I'm having has to do more with these quilts that I'm talking about. Like, I want to eventually get to a place where I'm doing unique quilts that I feel like no one else could make, that they're a Jeff Rutherford quilt. Even if it's incorporating music lyrics, the lyrics that I choose are usually not something that other people are going to choose. Not that they can't, but I really want to move towards very, very personal quilts. And the challenge there for me is almost very similar to when I was writing fiction, because you basically come to your sewing machine with a blank page, as opposed to a pattern, which is very rigid. It's like a jigsaw puzzle. If you have a pattern that someone designed, there's no question mark. It's like, you have to sew this piece, or you have to cut this piece 1.5 inches, and you have to cut this at 2 inches and sew them together with a precise 1/4 inch seam. So there's no question. But when I sit down to make a quilt that literally has no boundaries, that reflects who I am, then it's almost like sitting down to a blank page when I'm writing fiction, and it can be a little bit overwhelming to me. But that's the direction that I find myself. You can, I don't. You definitely can. I mean, there are people out there making quilts of literally all kinds of materials, including, there are people who, this is sad to say, but there are people who make memorial quilts, meaning they will take the clothing of someone who's passed away, a family member, a brother, sister, aunt, uncle, mother, father. They'll take that person's favorite clothes and fashion a quilt out of it. And I can totally understand the sentimental value of doing that. But to answer your question, usually when you're doing that, you're using a variety of materials, everything from corduroy to denim to some type of linen. So you can do that, and there are tools to do that, like interfacing to basically make the fabric stable for sewing. But I tend to use what is considered quilting cotton, which is 100% cotton.
Okay.
So this is the most recent. And you can see how these blocks all have multiple pieces. I don't know how many pieces of fabric went into this, but you can see that how each one of those has multiple pieces. So that's my most recent one. I can talk to you in just a minute. And then this is the one that I made 6 or 7 years ago. The pattern is called New York Beauty. And it's a traditional pattern. I really like the colors and the design. So here are some of the pieces. And this was based again on a pattern. The designer's name is Elizabeth Hartman. Those are some sea otters. And these are very, if you can see, all of those are individual pieces in a very specific designed pattern. This is one I was doing several years ago, an online quilting bee, which meant I was paired up with 11 other quilters, and each month one quilter would say, design me this block in these colors. And so that was left over from that. And then this was a block from the one that I just showed you that didn't end up getting used, the New York Beauty. Thank you. It's definitely part of the process, without a doubt. So I usually will have individual containers, and I know like I need X number of this specific block, whether it's a half square triangle or what's called a flying geese, and I just keep tracking. In fact, I mean, if you looked at my sewing table, I'll have scraps of paper where I've counted up how many I have, and then do the math of how many more I need to make. I don't think about accounting, but there's certainly, if you're doing a established pattern, there's definitely math involved. But it's, I mean, I'm far from someone who's a math expert, but it's really, addition, subtraction. And one thing that I oftentimes have to Google is reading a ruler, especially if you have a very precise pattern where it's calling. I mean, I've had ones where it's like 1/16. And so I just have to like remind myself of what that looks like on a ruler. But I don't say you have to be an expert, but you certainly need to know that there is some math involved. I haven't done any individual shows myself. I'm usually included in other shows with other quilters. I haven't done an exhibit of just mine yet. Something I'm working on. Oh, I love it. I have several friends who do that. One friend in particular, Jack Edson, who lives in the Buffalo, New York area, he specifically does portrait quilts. And it's interesting because oftentimes the subjects of his portrait quilts are American artists from the 1900s. And so there's almost some education going on. There have definitely been quilts that he's made that I wasn't familiar with the subject. I went and researched them and learned about their place in American art history. So I think there are lots of people doing some really interesting things in terms of what I would refer to as kind of illustrative or portrait quilts. My kids, I think my kids like it. They certainly enjoy the quilts I've made for them, and they seem interested, as I said, as they'll come by me while I'm working and make notice of certain colors or certain fabrics. I'm not sure exactly what they think, but I think they think it's good that I have something that I'm passionate and I'm interested in. My mother has said that some of her aunts and some of her relatives would really love to see the quilts that I've made. And interestingly enough, my paternal grandmother, the one that I mentioned earlier, unfortunately, she had passed away before I started making quilts, so she didn't get to see the quilts I made. But yeah, my parents are definitely interested in what I'm doing, and kind of surprised, I think, probably that I got so into it. I think it's interesting, and I've had friends who've taken weaving classes. I haven't done it myself. I mean, I'm still there, believe it or not. I mean, I've been doing this, like I said, since 2002, but there's still definitely techniques in quilting that I haven't done. So I feel like there's a lot for me still to learn. Actually, I mean, there actually are a lot of male quilters out there. They're just not as oftentimes, well known or thought of when someone thinks about quilting. But in terms of attracting others, I mean, I would just say I think that some of that is happening already, and probably not to be political in any way, but I think some of it has to do with just kind of the changing gender expectations. I think that ironically, I mean, because if you look back at the history of tailoring, especially like, I've had some conversations with some of the older male quilters that I know, like in the United States, Army and places like that, all of the people who were working on uniforms and tailoring were men. But I would say that, when I was growing up in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, there were certainly gender expectations around men sewing. But I think that a lot of people are starting to, question those types of things, that like, oh, like this is only for women. So I think it's just naturally you're going to see more people as they get comfortable and they realize that, like, hey, this is something that's interesting and I'm going to pursue it. And in fact, if you do much online research, a lot of the quilters, and not all. I mean, it's a big tent. There are people doing all kinds of quilts, but there is a big movement of, for the lack of a better word, modern quilts, and those tend to be very dynamic, use a lot of negative space, use solid colors, and usually when I've been at these modern quilting quilt shows, when people who are not into quilting kind of wander in and they're just blown away that, as you said, they associate quilting with being very rustic and something that grandmothers do, and they can't believe that here are these quilts that are abstract. They're based out of improv, where people are just kind of grabbing fabrics and putting them together in an improvisational way. Or, like I said, I mean, I'm certainly not the only one doing piece letters and words. And if you go to most modern quilt shows, you will see word quilts addressing the range of social issues that are facing, the world right now. Everything from climate change to racial justice, etc. I have taught a couple of really short classes just to my local guild, but it wasn't anything formal. It was more like, can you show us a technique and come for 30 or 40 minutes and show us the technique, which is what I've done. But I haven't done any formal teaching, not yet. Absolutely. There are a lot of people who do that. They'll recycle materials, whether it's clothing, whether it's, you even have people who will take old quilts and not just restore them, but update them, combine them with new fabrics, and really create a new piece of craft or art. It's really hard to say. It can be, I would say it usually takes a month or two, but again, there are projects that I put away, come back to, for a variety of reasons, whether it's just the intricacy of what I'm working on, and I don't want to do it for months and months at a time. So I kind of move around depending on what my mood is. I'll certainly make them a wedding quilt, without a doubt. I think that's something that a lot of quilters end up doing if they have family who are getting married or friends. So it's not something I've given a lot of thought to, but I'll certainly do that. I'm working on a Minecraft quilt for both of them right now that I hope to give them in the next few months. I think the future of quilting is very bright. If you look, as I just said, I mean, quilting is really, as an art form, addressing a lot of societal issues, as many artists do, but also beyond just what I would refer to as social justice quilts. There are a lot of quilts really pushing the boundaries of technique and expanding traditional quilt patterns and techniques. And I think that I will say that as an industry, that quilting probably has some bumps ahead. And what I mean by that is that if you go to most quilt shows, you will notice that a lot of quilters are, and I don't say this in a negative way, but it's a lot of the quilting audience right now is kind of an aging audience. And so I think that even though quilting remains a multi-billion-dollar industry, I think that there are certainly probably some bumps in the road but that's really from the industry standpoint of people who are people who are fabric designers and the companies that make fabric. But as an art form, I think that there is just huge potential in quilting and fiber arts. I should know more than I do. I think over the long term, if you have an heirloom quilt, that I would suggest that people research beyond what I can tell them about how to preserve it. I think there might be some special containers, etc., that you could store it in. But certainly, if a quilt is a well-loved and well-used quilt, it will eventually develop problems just in terms of threads coming untied And there are people who will repair and fix older quilts. So that's pretty much all I can offer you. No, actually, I mean, it's something that I'm interested in. I would like to do more drawing. I would like to do more painting. And I've even thought about, once the pandemic is over, taking some pottery classes. But I don't do a lot of sketching or drawing or painting. I'm really focused on the quilt making. Really as I mentioned, the Quilting Stories podcast, where I'm interviewing quilters. And then the Reading and Writing podcast, where I interview writers and authors, and that's going full steam ahead. During the pandemic, I've interviewed a lot of writers. Yes. Certainly the isolation has worn on me, and later today I am getting my first vaccine shot, which I'm happy about. But definitely the isolation has certainly, it's worn thin. I try to do yoga. I do some meditation. I do a lot of physical exercise, so that's pretty much what I'm focused on. That's a good question. I would say that I don't tend to kick back and relax probably as much as I should. So yeah, I do a lot of podcasting. I do a lot of quilting. Usually I'm reading at night. I probably don't watch as much TV as maybe some people, but I certainly watch movies, and so yeah. So that's I have a pretty packed schedule, I guess is what I would say. Sure. I would encourage everyone who has seen a quilt, has fond memories of a quilt, or has a favorite quilt, and is interested in possibly making a quilt, to really pursue that passion. I think that some people would really be surprised at how relaxing and engaging of a craft and art that quilting can be. And probably what I would suggest to most people, and what I oftentimes suggest to people, is if they are interested, the best thing to do, and especially now that here in the States, there's more vaccinations and more stores opening up, I would definitely recommend that they find a local quilt store and try to find an in-person quilt class to attend, because and it all comes back to how people learn. But I think that it's very invaluable to have a teacher really show you the importance of some of the basic concepts around quilting, how to do a 1/4 inch seam and how to make some of the basic blocks. Having said all of that, I would say that when I started in 2002, one of the things that I did not have at my disposal, which new quilters do, is YouTube and the internet. So if someone is isolated or they don't feel like they learn best in a class, I would just say dive in online, because you will just find innumerable resources for quilting. There are quilt blogs out there where people give you step-by-step instructions. And as many people know, YouTube is just endless with quilting videos. So the knowledge is out there. Don't be intimidated. Don't feel like you have to buy a $2,000 sewing machine. When I started, I literally bought an entry-level machine because I wanted to see if it was something that I would really pursue. So I would just say grab an entry-level sewing machine if you're interested, and have fun.